This is Wix.
Okay, perfect. Okie dokie. Boy, I sound super Midwestern there. Welcome back after our snow day hiatus. Which we had a foot of snow, just at Milwaukie Lutheran, nowhere else. Well, I was joking at the Wednesday midweek service that if I would have not canceled service, we would have gotten a foot of snow. But because I did, and I was talking to some of our colleagues, like Katie down in Milwaukie Presbyterian, and she's like, "Oh, we just canceled it or no, we made the decision Sunday morning." I'm like, "We can't do that." I'm like, if you've got a community where everybody is on social media, like waiting for that announcement, that might work, but that's not going to fly here. So whatever.
We all live in different areas.
What's that?
We all live in different areas.
And that's part of it too, right? Is that where I was at, we had ice. My hill was still icy. At 12:30, because yes, I stayed up past midnight to see if the snow was going to come. The snow was coming down hard, but when I woke up Sunday morning, it was all gone. I felt a little bit silly, but then I slept in. So, yeah. Okay, let's do a little. It's been so we took a week off. Let's do a quick recap. For those of you who haven't participated yet, we are building our own model of discipleship. Building might be a strong word, but we're putting together ideas. What are the words that we've already had up there? I'll start with the one that I contributed. So what are the, Curiosity. Thank you, Ricky. Let me write my word up. Thank you, Mike, for getting me this nice, much larger.
That's not how you spell discipleship.
We'll get a better one.
We're making our own discipleship. But thank you for catching that.
We're building it, and you've got teachers in here.
That's what happens when I spell while talking. How's that? Is that better?
That's better.
Thank you, Karen. So we had curiosity being one of the traits that is desirable in people who take this commitment on. What else? What other words did we come up with? Learning, yeah. Especially since that is built into the word disciple. We have already established that those who are following Jesus, whether they're the 12 or the crowd beyond, are people that are there in a rabbi-student relationship. So Jesus fulfilling the role of teacher, and everybody else fulfilling the role of learner. Humility was the word we had up there too. This came up again, and I will say, and I will make a flip. I will say last week, meaning 2 weeks ago. I hope that you're able to do that interpretation. But that is one of the things that we also talked about 2 weeks ago. Insofar as, well, it's contrasted with another word, which I'll put up there, which was leadership. Which, I'm going to put an asterisk by this one. It's not that it doesn't belong up there, but I think that we have to be mindful of what picture we're thinking of when we think of leadership. And the reason being is, I listen to a lot of podcasts. One of the podcasts that I was listening to recently is Jon Stewart's, sort of new podcast, but he was talking with the CEO of JP Chase Morgan, right? That's a different model of leadership. And I don't think that the model of leadership that we're talking about in discipleship has a whole lot to do with being the CEO of a multinational corporation. There might be some crossover in there, but again, the reason I brought this up is that one of the pieces that is in there is this humility piece, which we also talked about, servant being another word that might fit under this category. We use the phrase servant leadership so often with regards to what we're doing in the church. Courage. Joe, what were you going to say?
Under leadership, I think you need to have supporters.
Yes.
Not everyone is a leader.
Yes.
They have their people follow them, support them. No.
And I think that actually it helps explain what I was trying to get at a little bit too. Is that when we build models of communities, metaphorical models, so often we single out people to be in leadership, like they're the designated leader. I think Joe, what you're getting at too, is that we move into and out of these roles as disciples. Is that sometimes we're fulfilling a leadership role, sometimes we're fulfilling a supportive role, and that the ability to move between these two depends heavily on this. We're kind of getting into conjecture here a little bit, which is good, right? Which is very good. There's nothing wrong with that. But eventually, hopefully, we'll be able to kind of point to some gospel examples of how this dynamic plays out. Not hopefully. I know we will. This is going to come up, especially as we get closer. Yeah, especially as we get closer to the end of the book. Any other words that are up there?
Oh, we didn't talk about it, but accompaniment.
And we will get to this intentionally, because this is a big one. And we're going to see this come in multiple forms, both when we hope, and by the way, my plan for today is recap, talk about another word that's going to be up here. It starts with an S. But then I want to get to talking, or actually looking at the text where the disciples start doing things, right? As opposed to just talking about how they're called and that kind of stuff. So, accompaniment is going to be very important when we get to the text where people start doing things, right? Where the disciples start following the teaching, following the example of Jesus. And when he actually sends them out, that's going to be a huge piece. So, thank you, Susan. Anything else that we want to be up there? I'm just wondering if your memory is better than mine. Loyalty.
Well, if you have to have all those things, maybe that's why it's kind of hard to.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Right? And that's a great point, Pat. That is a great
What did
point.
she say?
She says if you have to have all these things, maybe that's why it's kind of hard to be a disciple. Spot on. and we'll talk about this too, because here's the other thing, is that the idea at the beginning of this, when I did my intro Sunday, right in the first day, so I talked about how we have maybe overcomplicated discipleship, right? And we maybe perhaps are at a risk of overcomplicating it. However, there are things that are complicated that become simple, right? So take, for example, learning to golf, I guess, right? But how many hours do people spend perfecting what looks like a very simple mechanical motion, right? I used to golf when I was younger. I thankfully stepped away from that very frustrating sport. But I remember, yeah, I did. That's why I quit. I checked that one off my list. And I was like, well, on to the next thing. Let's go to seminary. But I remember, and I used to, and I still do, have an awful slice. Don't tell me your tips. I've already heard all of them, right? But I remember, standing up to the tee and being like, thinking of all the things like, okay, hips, knees flexed, are my hands lined up, my shoulder comes back, all this stuff. And then at the end of the day, right, it's just about hitting a ball. But we can go both directions. However, I will say that knowing little things to work on and working on them, in the end, did help me hit the ball better some of the time. You know? So yeah, that's a really good point, Pat, is that if you look at this list, that's a lot of characteristics, especially if we're seeing that these are things that we should try to embody in ourselves and being disciples, which I think is kind of what we're getting at. But I think as well, what we're talking about are markers that markers that are potentially, how do we say this? Signifiers of what it looks like to be somebody who's being transformed by the process of following Jesus. That was a big sentence. Okay. But we'll come back to that. Okay. Thank you for helping me rebuild this list. Let's talk about the conversation we were having not last week, but 2 weeks ago, which revolved around another word, another question that we have, which is this question of who, right? So we built a picture, several Venn diagrams, several concentric circles, where we talked about who exactly were the people that were following, metaphorically and also physically. We talked about the importance that that these were people who were physically following a human being, and therefore our process is going to be different insofar as that we don't have the physical Jesus walking in front of us, showing us these things. But the who was, 12 at the center, or the edges, and then perhaps 70 or 700. So this group that would have been probably with Jesus most of the time, right? But may or may not have been following him from place to place, right? So these would be committed people like Mary and Martha and Lazarus, right? Who were committed to the cause, whatever that means. But Mary and Martha and Lazarus would meet up with Jesus when he came to their area of the world, right? Their area of Israel. So we got to imagine as well that there were other people just like this, because one of the things that we see in the beginning of the Gospels is that Jesus travels extensively while he's in Galilee. What are some of the places that he goes to outside of the Sea of Galilee? These are some old words. We don't call the places these names anymore. But Tyre, Tyre, right? Tyre and Sidon, the Decapolis, right? These are regions that are near Galilee, walking distance, but are outside of what would be considered Israel, right? This is going to be important as we think about this, right? But back to my original point is that there were people that were very committed to this cause, or committed to following, committed to being learners, but weren't camping, right? They weren't part of the backpacking trip that Jesus and 12 were on, okay? And then beyond that are the crowds. So these are the people who have been impacted to greater or lesser extents by what Jesus and his disciples are doing. But I wouldn't necessarily say that they are falling under this heading, right? They were onlookers. That's a good word. They were onlookers. Onlookers who may have been curious. Yeah. Onlookers who may have been curious. And who probably did some learning, right? Yeah, a little bit as well. May have been supporters.
There's an old term called fellow travelers.
Fellow travelers. That sounds like something from a fantasy novel.
It's more of I think
hello, fellow traveler.
Maybe a Leninist thing.
Leninist thing? That's great. So that's kind of our 10,000 foot picture of the disciples, right? The categories. Not last week, 2 weeks ago, we read the story of the call of Levi or Matthew, or both. Again, this is one of the more ambiguous parts of our early gospel records, is that we have these 3 stories that are in the synoptics. 2 of those stories in Luke and Mark the tax collector who's sitting in the booth that Jesus comes to and calls to follow is named Levi, except in the Gospel of Matthew. We have almost the exact same story, except that person's name is Matthew. Now, the historical calculus that scholars and, well, Christians from 2,000 years ago have done is we've said, well, Matthew describes himself as this person, so he would know better than anybody else what his name was. So maybe this is a scenario where Levi is his Hebrew name, Matthew is, a Hellenistic name. We don't know, okay? We're just going to assume that they're the same person. The confusing thing is that this person is described as Levi, son of Alphaeus, okay? And then in later descriptions, even in Luke and Mark, we have Matthew and James, son of Alphaeus. So is it Levi, or is it Matthew, or is it James that's sitting in this booth? Doesn't really matter, okay, in the long run. Doesn't really matter. I just find it funny. Okay? So whenever somebody says to you, but the Bible is so clear, just point to that one and ask them who to think. So who said the owl. Who follows Jesus? Okay, well, who are the people that Jesus ends up having dinner with after calling Levi and or Matthew and or James, that upset the Pharisees? Tax collectors and sinners. And what's that? Outcasts. We're going to put this word here. Outcasts. And the reason I put, I mentioned this before, the reason we put a capital S on sinners is that this, in the gospel witness, this is not necessarily describing, from a modern perspective, people like us who sin. We all sin. It's describing a category of people, a category that Joe just pointed out, which are people that for some reason have been identified as being outside the boundaries of what it means to be in good standing with the faith, so to speak, right? Which is much more delineated in Jewish culture around this time than we might see. Because we absolutely ostracize people, we cast people out intentionally or unintentionally. We draw lines of where we think good people and bad people are, and we do all these things in the modern era, right? In our own experience, explicitly or implicitly. In first century Israel, that line was a little bit more firm, a little bit more. What's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. Excluded. Yeah, it was explicit, right? It was explicit. It was excluding insofar as that your relationship to God was mediated vis-a-vis your relationship to the temple, right? And we know that regular Hebrew practice meant doing things like making sacrifice to atone for your sins, right? And what if you're unable to do that, right? Because of poverty or illness or whatever. So what we see throughout the Gospels is we see Jesus encountering a lot of these capital S sinners. Some of them are people who, like Levi or Matthew or James, have a profession or an identity that makes them outcast. Why were tax collectors so despised? They took your money. Yeah, still are. I don't know if we have any IRS employees in here.
Well, it's catching.
It's catching? Yeah. How so? What do you mean by that, Pat? What do you mean by it? Why is it catching her?
Well, if you touch a leper, you're going to get this.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah, when we're talking about these capital S sinners, these outcasts, there are people for whom their outcast status is because leprosy, blindness, essentially maladies of the body that aren't curable, right? Because, especially something so outwardly visible as leprosy, aka any skin condition whatsoever, that falls under the Levitical category, right? If it's a raised bump, I can't remember, I'm not going to quote the description exactly, but we talked about this. But if it's a raised bump that doesn't go away, or if it changes colors, which could describe melanomas, could describe potentially a whole array of skin diseases like eczema, psoriasis. They all fell under the category of leprosy, and put them into this category of outcasts. And one of the things, and one of the reasons why they are literally outcasted, is because of the fear that their stuff is going to touch your, get into your stuff, right? That's a much bigger topic within Hebrew thought, because one of the major things that motivates a lot of the cleanliness, uncleanliness categories is a different thing. It's blood, right? So there was a whole host of, that's why you have all these things, like after a woman's time in the month, she must purify for 7 days before rejoining the assembly. After warriors come back from battle, they have to purify for a set of days. It's because blood carries life, it carries essence, and you can become contaminated by the blood / life / essence of other people. But that's not what we're talking about necessarily today. And there's another category in there as well, too. Two more categories as well, too. Thank you, Linda. That was a very important category that fell off my radar. The stranger, the alien, or the foreigner, right?
I started to say alien, but then people would interpret that differently.
Yeah. That came up in one of the other podcasts that I've been listening to. Never mind. It's theology podcast. It has nothing to do with aliens. They're joking about. Anyways, okay. Yeah, the stranger, the alien, and the foreigner, which is, well, never mind. We'll come back to that. Okay, those are people who would be considered outside the assembly. Gentiles would be a word that might be there, this is this interesting blending of categories. These are people who may live in and amongst the people of Israel, but because they aren't Jewish, are still considered outsiders, right?
You're pushing us towards Samaritans.
Not intentionally.
Yeah, but I feel it.
But that's a really good one, Samaritan. So never mind, there were 3 categories. Samaritan. But those are good ones. That's a good one to talk about. Okay, let me finish my list and we'll come back to Samaritans, because that really drives this thing home. Okay. But now I forgot what my other category was. Mentally ill, right? Which I'm already doing some interpretation here, so feel free to uninterpret if you need to. But we have so many stories in the New Testament, in the Gospel witness, of Jesus and his disciples encountering people who have demons or spirits cast out of them, right? I'm doing an interpretive thing as a modern white male, which is I'm interpreting those experiences as being experiences of mental health issues, right? Which may or may not be a no-no, right? Because when we do that, I'm also limiting in some ways what that might mean. So rather than maybe saying mental health, let's say people who are afflicted by spirits, right? Because that would be the category that this community would have understood. You understand what I'm getting at here? Well, I'm going to erase all this in a second anyways, but that was my last category. Okay, so here's the question I left you with 2 weeks ago, and they said, this is my homework for you, is think about that word sinners, and what does it mean that Jesus calls sinners, right? Because that's in that Matthew text, right? Where the Pharisees confront Jesus, And they say, why are you eating with tax collectors and sinners? And he says, I didn't come to call the righteous, but I came to call the sinners, right? So what does it mean? This is what we're going to talk about for 15 minutes. What does it mean that Jesus intentionally calls sinners? Here's I want to stop you before you say anything. Don't think about you right now. Okay, don't do the theological interpretive piece, which is from a modern perspective, acknowledge that we're all under the burden of sin, right? Whether you acknowledge an idea of original sin or whether you just identify that human beings, simul justus et peccator, right, simultaneously sinner and saint. Who are these people? Who are the capital S sinners? And what does it mean that Jesus calls them to be disciples? Not accidentally, but intentionally. Starting with Levi, the tax collector. So tax collectors are people that take your money. They are people who take your money to give it to a foreign entity, in this case, when you're already kind of sort of getting taxed by your own government. So again, as a Jew living in first century Israel, you're paying tithe to the temple, and you're also getting taxed by your Roman governor. Okay, so Pontius Pilate, whose office was in Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, he was the overseer of that tri-county area. And Pontius Pilate would be, the one that's responsible for effecting the census, which is essentially a roll of all the tax-paying citizens in that part of the empire. So a tax collector wasn't just somebody who took your money. Somebody who took your money and gave it to these people, not just aliens, but the foreign oppressors, right? The people whose yoke you're trying to throw off. So you can understand perhaps why tax collectors might have been universally reviled in that society.
Well, and they also took more than they.
Yeah.
And that is that is absolutely true. Is that well, let me put it this way: they were known for taking more, right? Unfortunately, we can't go back and have the Pew Foundation for Research do a poll and find out what percentage of tax collectors are skimming off the top, right? We can't see that data. But it was assumed, it was believed by a large enough critical mass of people that that's what tax collectors did. Enough so that people just assumed that if you're a tax collector, you're also a cheat, right? You're also taking more money than you need to. So yeah, that's another reason why they're reviled. Matt.
No, I think if you think about these tax collectors, another part of them is that they were actually pretty well connected.
Yes.
The power structure of the government and community there. And so, for example, when after Jesus calls Matthew, they have a big dinner at Matthew's house. And some people say, well, look at here, Jesus going over and having dinner with these sinners. So if you think about sinners, they're not talking about, cookies or, prostitutes. They're talking about some of the most influential people, the people with real control in that community.
Totally could be. Absolutely. I'll repeat what Matt said. So Matt's saying, so Jesus, and sorry, I'm going to add my preface in. So Jesus walks up to this tax booth, recruits Matthew, and then immediately afterwards, Matthew, who's probably fairly wealthy, right? Insofar as a tax collector can be wealthy. I mean, he's not. Matthew is likely a Jewish person who has taken on this role. So he's about as high up as a person of his background can get within Roman government. But he immediately invites Jesus to a dinner where it's described that he sits down with other tax collectors and sinners. The direction that our brain goes is to think that the people at this dinner are these people. In other words,
Politicians.
well, you're getting ahead of me, Linda. The picture that I think we tend to paint in our heads is that he's sitting down with all of the outcasts. When, Matt, you're probably onto something there, that the people that Matthew most likely invited to dinner are people who are his people, his equals, other tax collectors, and other people that have been identified by the Jewish authority as being outcasts, but not necessarily for all the reasons that we got up here. So again, what Matt's alluding to, I don't know if you're alluding to this. I'm going to put words in your mouth, so forgive me. Matt, Jesus might be practicing some strategy here. Did you ever think about this? Jesus recruits as his first disciples who? Fishermen who also have access to a boat, a means of fast travel in a region where normally you have to circumnavigate. What's the word? Circumvent, whatever. Walk around the lake. I was waiting to see how long it takes for somebody to just. He recruits people with a boat, right? Do you think it's beyond belief that perhaps Jesus recruits Matthew, who probably has connections to the Roman government, at least the local government, at least, intentionally because?
Think this is strategy?
Yeah, it could be. Absolutely. Absolutely could be strategy. Here's another way to frame this, though, right? Because I don't know if your brains are going in this direction. My brain tends to go this direction. That makes me a little bit uneasy, this idea that Jesus is networking. Oh, God, how I've learned to despise that phrase. What's that, Ricky?
But if you only went to the people that are the good people, sort of thing.
Yes.
Then,
I mean, you're going the direction that I'm going with this, which is, it makes me uneasy to think of Jesus, to frame him in the same category as like hedge fund managers, right? Who are the people that do a lot of networking, salespeople and stuff like that? But keep in mind that, yes, Jesus is recruiting tax collector who has connections, but one of the things that becomes a point of conflict for the disciples in the beginning, but later becomes a big point of conflict, is this idea that, let me put this a different way. What do you think Peter and James and John, and maybe a couple of other disciples, what do you think they think when Jesus recruits Matthew? Do you think they're overjoyed? Do you think they're maybe a little bit surprised, confused? Yeah. Who are these people that Matthew potentially has connection to? Are they Jews of good standing? No, probably not. They're probably not Jews of good standing. They are Gentiles, perhaps. I mean, this is conjecture. We have no idea here, right? It just says tax collectors and sinners. We're imagining, okay? Could be Gentiles, could be people of good standing, could not be people of good standing, right? Could be that Matthew, being a tax collector in the town, is so outcast and ostracized that he befriends anybody that would befriend him.
Just say the other.
The other, yeah, it's the other, right? Matthew is singing out the other. Jesus, one second.
Yeah, just
one second.
It's not completely the other. It is the other. You're othering.
Yes.
But this is in my mind. I've always said, what's the corollary today? And
yes.
And why assume that the governance is always oppressive when in the Book of Acts it's the Pax Romana that makes the spread of the gospel throughout the Mediterranean possible, right?
Absolutely.
And so all of a sudden, and then of course by the time you get to Constantine 300 years later, it's like, no, the government's us. And then now you're in the 21st century and you've got all these people saying, yes, Jesus and the American flag are the exact same thing.
Yes.
And so it's always been this interaction between authority and power and the people who deliver your social security check to your door, and who administer the Medicaid laws, and on and on and on and on. And I think we've been extremely, I'm gonna say, I believe that most of us are naive when it comes to our understanding of how it is that Jesus sees human governance and its benefits as well as its liabilities. Okay? And so in discipleship is part of the question of humility there. And I think that for the last 500 years, I think Germanic and Scandinavian Lutherans have basically said, well, I think the Kaiser is God's Kaiser. I think the king is God's king. I think the government is God's government, right? And so we assume that it leads us, as not just as far, but as far as, being Lutheran Nazis and being Lutheran, okay? So we have huge questions here because the who is really critical.
Yeah.
You're asking who is this Jesus and how much is he embracing necessarily sinful systems
Absolutely.
that we all participate in because we have to pay the tax.
Yes. Absolutely.
So that we would like to other them. We would like to other them so much that we don't have to pay them tax. But we can't.
Well, I guess my point of other is they weren't the mainstream Jewish followers. And that's where Jesus is going.
And
Sure, there's that too. But my sense is we, in our humility of, well, God wants me to obey them. We use it. The general prayer of the church was always, for the President of the United States, the members of the Congress, the Supreme Court, that we would pray for these
I remember.
the members of the armed forces.
Yep.
And so this is a super important question.
It is.
I'm trying to let you know it's important.
No. Well, and Paul, you have brought in the implications of this question, right? And what I was doing was which is probably always an error as a metaphor. I was metaphorically leading the horse to water, which is where I'm moving towards is the conversation that's happening between you two right now.
Right.
So Peter, James, John, salt of the earth, good old, Jewish fishermen. That's a gross categorization. And we don't know who these guys were. Maybe they were outcasts as well too. But how do they see Matthew? Okay, they see him as another, right? For a lot of reasons, the reasons we talked about. Okay, but it's about more than just Matthew, right? In calling Matthew, Jesus is also accessing a whole host of people that your stereotypical Jewish citizen would have assumed are far beyond. And it's not about, keep in mind, it's not about eternal salvation. But they can't be part of the nation of Israel, right? For very good reasons. Okay, this is one of the things that we get caught up on is that we talked about this as well too, is that we equate this to salvation or to eschatology. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the nuts and bolts of the people that are doing the work of Jesus. Peter, James, and John would have assumed that if they knew in advance that Jesus was going to call 9 more people, that they were 9 more people that would look like them. Maybe not fishermen, but people that fell within the good standing of the temple. By recruiting Matthew or Levi or James, suddenly that bursts that assumption wide open. Okay? And we see that in the event of Jesus sitting down with Matthew and Matthew's friends, whoever they are, right? For whatever reason. Because Matt's right, it may have been people like other tax collectors and people that Matthew networked with. It may also, to go to kind of like the traditional capital S picture, it may have also been people who have been cast out from their homes, people who are sleeping on the streets, people who are struggling with mental illness, people who are lepers, people who are identified culturally as we use the word prostitutes, but what that category generally, it's an umbrella category which includes women who don't conform to the gender and sexual norms of their day, right? Because it's women who may or may not be living alone, and they just assume that woman was a prostitute. Okay, so in other words, yeah, it may be people that look like Matthew. It may be other people, but the point is that Jesus has suddenly burst open the assumptions of who exactly this movement is about. Okay, and it's bursting open all kinds of things, but it's also changing the perspective because the Roman government was seen as the great evil by so many. And I'm not going to debate that, right? Their empire, okay? And I'm not so sure that overthrowing the Roman government was even in Jesus's worldview, okay? We see pictures of that. So to bring in somebody who's either directly or tangentially connected to the Roman government, there's also, maybe not intentionally, maybe accidentally, an implicit peace treaty. I don't know how to articulate. Jesus is essentially saying, I'm not here to fight with these folks. In fact, not only am I not here to fight with these folks can participate in what we're doing. Okay? Does that register? Okay.
Like placating?
No, it's not placating, in fact. It's challenging the assumptions of the people who thought that they had it figured out. Matthews and the James and the Johns. Okay. And I'm putting words and thoughts into
The
there.
phrase of opening the door.
He's opening the doors wide open.
That makes all
Okay. So, Paul, you started to ask a question, which is the question that I wanted to get to, which is, okay, we talked about who the capital S sinners were in Jesus' day and age. We're building a modern model of discipleship. Who is this? It is us. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay.
It's the most inclusive word you can imagine.
It is.
That's the essence of this, is that who do I other out of a quarantine mentality?
Yeah.
Right? Because of all these dermatological issues.
Yeah.
And who do I say, this person, I will welcome this person into my family. I'm glad my children are choosing these people for their life partners. This is very important, then and now. And how do I embrace these, non-Scandinavian Lutheran people?
Oh, yeah. Well, don't get too far. And we laugh about that. And rightly so. It's a laughable thing. But hey, man, rewind 50 years. My community that I grew up in, right? We were primarily Norwegian immigrants that came over in the late 1800s, right? And continued to be Norwegian Lutherans up through my childhood. And I remember they didn't make a stink out of it like, we want only Norwegians here. But when we had people that would join the church that, whose last name didn't end in S-O-N or S-E-N or a variation thereof, right? There were polite questions, sometimes impolite questions asked about, well, where do you come from, right? And you're not Scotch-Irish, are you? No. My great-grandmother was Scotch-Irish, which was a huge scandal within the community, right? Which is why I turned out so well. But no, I remember because we lived not so far from the Polish town of Posen, Michigan, right? And every once in a while we would have, Krawczaks or Lewandowskis or whatever that would come over. And boy, that SKI at the end of the name really singles you out. So my point is that it's not so long ago that we might not have said, well, those people can't follow Jesus, but we might have said those people can't follow Jesus with us.
My little town in North Dakota has the most ever had 400 people,
Yeah.
including the farmers.
Yeah.
And we had 3 different Lutheran churches, German Lutheran.
Nailed it. You nailed it, Pat. Yeah. And they were called the First Norwegian Lutheran Church. I don't know, but so often they were called, the First German Lutheran Church of Fort Wayne, Indiana, right? That was a church that only recently had changed its name when I moved there.
And to be fair, we trust people that we're around.
Yes.
We silo, and I would think that in many cases those silos were not maybe even as intentional as now. Maybe there's less fear going on, but there's always fear of getting the who right.
Yeah.
And saying, well, your Jesus ain't quite the right Jesus.
Yes.
And so if I'm going to be curious, I'm going to be also curious about how your Jesus doesn't sit well with me. And this is a discipleship question as well.
It is. And I want to throw something out there as well, too, is emphasis on your last word there. This is a discipleship question, okay? Yeah. We're not going to solve this one.
No.
In fact, the intent is we're not going to come up with another list of words of who falls in here, okay? This is a very Peter Rollins kind of postmodern thing, which is that the question itself is the purpose, okay? It's not to answer it. It's that what we are called to do as disciples is to keep asking this question. Who else? Right? Who else is Jesus calling to do this walk with me? Who else might show up and participate in this movement?
Well, the flip side of that would be who isn't he?
And that's I would argue that's implicit in there, right? It's implicit in there. Is, well, who isn't?
My answer would be no.
Yes. Well, and then we get into some really sticky ground, which we will get to, is the question of, well, we already asked it, right? Number one, we're placing big emphasis on this word. We already painted this picture of there are core people that are following and participating. There's crowds, right, that are just curious. So, perhaps not everyone is called to this specific role. Or perhaps they are, but not everyone participates in this specific role.
Discipleship always have to be the exact ABC.
And that's it, right? Is that one of the other things that we open up when we open up this is how I'm just understanding the process to go. Does this process look different for other people? Maybe it's not a process. But we did address this 2 weeks ago as well, which is that we're also making the assumption that this is a one and done, right? Once a disciple, always a disciple. One of the things that we really need to point out, and we have scriptural witness to this, right? It's in the calling of what's his face they flipped the lots for, right? He was in one category, they literally flip a coin, now he's in the inner category, right? There's obviously some mobility there. Do you think, and using the 12 as an example isn't perhaps the best because that's such a specific thing, but do you think that perhaps there are people within this inner outer circle of Jesus that moved in and out of being his disciple?
Yes.
Yeah, well, and we see it happen. We see it happen in the Acts of the Apostles, but in Paul's epistles. We had this reading a couple of weeks ago where Paul says, not Apollos, not Paul, not blah, 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 this laundry list of early Christian influencers, which that's one of the best descriptions of what they were, right? Influencers were not invented with YouTube, right? In fact, the way that many of those early churches got founded were by early Christian influencers. And Paul's saying, who are we following? Are we following Apollos or Paul, or name your influencer? Are we following Jesus? But the reason he's making this argument is because he's writing to a church that has followed one of these influencers into saying, well, Paul wasn't right, right? Or Peter wasn't right. And the kind of background situation that we're watching going on here is an early church that's very much in conflict over this question that we're asking, which is the identity. Who are we? But who gets to participate? And again, one of the biggest debates in the early church is, are Gentiles allowed? Even though, by this point, we are so far past this. We are so far past this question, but hey, not much has changed, right? Lutheran Church is the ordaining, well, the Lutheran Church. The ELCA, its predecessor body, has been ordaining women since 1970, okay? We still do not agree with other, quote unquote, Christian traditions as to that specific topic, right? There are very many, including the largest Protestant denomination in the United States of America, the Southern Baptist Convention, which does not explicitly ordain women. We're not sitting on islands. In 2009, we agreed as a church to make it permissible to ordain openly gay and openly LGBTQIA plus folks. Okay, that one goes without explanation, right? Right. We as mainline Protestants are probably in the minority with regards to that decision. Okay, so we Presbyterian, I mean the others that have, well, Methodists aren't there yet. They're still tearing themselves apart over this question. The SBC certainly doesn't. None of our quote-unquote evangelical non-denominational big boxes ordain openly gay people. So we're still really heavily debating this, okay? And here's where I think we need to be explicit about the way that we name this, which is to say who else, right? Is instead of drawing our circle right around these folks and saying, well, we've identified the ones for sure, or doing any work to try to categorize who else is walking with us. And there's an assumption in there which I also wanted to sell, which is that we're also assuming that we're following Jesus at the same time, right? Which we may, in fact, come into encounters where we encounter the who else and we realize we're the else, right? Here's somebody who has been heavily involved in doing these things, and we're the one that's assuming that we're doing these things, and we encounter the legit thing. We're like, oh, okay, maybe I've got some learning to do. Okay, my brain's about fried. I trust that yours is too. I think my coffee is starting to wear off. So 5 minutes. I got 5 minutes yet, Paul. I can make it down there. Henry's here today. He can set up the live stream. So let's talk real quickly. You got 4 minutes. Let's talk real quickly about the what. I know.
Thank you.
That's Paul. Okay. If you've got a Bible in front of you, flip to Mark 6. I hope you all took the mental image of this. Yeah, good enough. This is what I just assume that since we have enough people in here that we'll all remember most of it. We'll remember it together.
We'll get a bigger board than
Don't encourage me. Do not encourage me.
we'll get a 4x8.
Next thing you know, we're gonna rip out all these closets. That whole thing is gonna be whiteboard. Okay. This is your homework, by the way. Okay. What? So we've identified traits, potentially, some traits, maybe not all the traits, maybe some of them are sort of traits, of what describes these folks. We've started to ask the question of who gets to do this, right? Who participates in this process? Now let's ask the question, which we've been all dying to get to, is what are we supposed to be doing? You got us all sit down here, you've been listening to this junk, and I imagine, 3 minutes. 2 minutes. 2 minutes, okay. Let's read the Bible text, and then whatever time I have left over, I can talk hear myself.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Mark 6, starting at verse 7. Then he went among the villages, teaching. He called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2, and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He ordered them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, semicolon, different clause here, no bread, no bag, no money, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. Come back to that one. He said to them, Wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the place. If any place will not welcome you and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that's on your feet as a testimony against them. So they went out, proclaimed that all should repent. They cast out many demons and anointed with oil many of those who were sick and cured them. Okay. This is not the sum total of the what, okay? But this is the introduction to the what. This is Mark's introduction to the what. Each of the Gospels has a version of this, the sending, right? So here's what we know so far, is that they've done the learning. They maybe job shadowed Jesus for some time now. We don't know how much time. Could have been a month, could have been a year. That's a good question. At some point, Jesus says, okay, you've apprenticed long enough. Now it's time for you to do the work. Okay? That's the work, or at least at the beginning of the work. Okay? As we read through the rest of our story, we find that the work is elaborated on. So we get, different context, we get different stuff that happens. We see a lot of this flesh out of exactly what Jesus means by casting out demons and curing the sick, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the start, okay? There's a part 2 to the what, so it's not just what they're doing, but how they're doing it, which I guess is just a how question. That's something that we're gonna think about side by side, because a lot of times the how is as important as the what, okay? So how did they get sent out? Pretty vulnerable, just one tunic, not two, okay. We'll talk about that. But here's the seed that I want to drop in your brain before you meander over to worship time, okay? At what point, for those of you who have learned a hobby or a skill or a job or whatever, at what point do you start doing the what? Do you start doing the what when you're 100% confident of what you're doing? Yeah, right? Okay.
Start standing up in front of a class for the first time.
Yeah, what was your first day as a teacher like? What was my first day standing in front of a group of people like this? It's terrifying, and I was ready to quit, and that was pretty much the first year. So here's my quick anecdote. Quick in quotes. So I've been making glass with this friend of Len's, coworker, right? The first time we went over there, I assumed that I was just going to sit there watching the whole time because, number one, there is molten glass involved, an open flame that's about 1,700 degrees at the tip, okay? And I have nothing. I don't know anything. I know nothing about glass. And here was the extent of his teaching. He's like, today we're going to add color to glass and twist it and make whatever shape you want. Here's what this looks like. And he did a bunch of stuff in about 5 minutes. And then said, which burner do you want, Jesse? Okay. Well, I would love to believe that Jesus, job shadowed the disciples for 2 years. And then the last year said, okay, you're trained enough that we can do this. I suspect, however, that they got a really short crash course and then were doing alongside for the entirety of it. So that's my seed. Let's think about this for next week. And what I would like you to do, this is your actual homework, is think of an experience in your lifetime that was like that, where you trained in something and then you delivered on it, and how we'll share some of those stories next week. Okay.
Thank you.
On to worship.